Well, Lockheed Martin and the Filecoin Foundation will explore hosting blockchain nodes in outer space. The two plan to identify a test mission by August of this year. Joining us now to discuss is Marta Belcher, General Counsel and Head of Policy at the Filecoin Foundation. Hello, Marta. Thanks for joining us. So I guess first and foremost, just the first top of mind question comes, why does this need to be in outer space?
So what we're bringing to outer space is the Interplanetary File System, IPFS. And IPFS was actually designed with the idea that it could enable interplanetary networking. So this was actually the original reason that IPFS was developed, and this was really what Juan had in mind when he was developing this technology. And so we're so excited to be able to announce here in Davos this week that we'll be partnering with Lockheed Martin to make that vision a reality and to bring IPFS to space.
Is the idea that putting it on Earth is not safe enough? Or, you know, if we were to have a nuclear winter, at least we have our files safely stored in beyond the Earth?
So here's the idea. The idea is that today's centralized internet model just doesn't work in space. So imagine that you're on the moon and you're surfing the web. Every time you click, that data has to go back and forth from a centralized server using today's internet model. So there's going to be a multi-second delay as that content is retrieved from Earth. But with IPFS, data doesn't need to go back and forth from Earth with every click. So instead, with IPFS will retrieve the content from wherever's closest rather than retrieving content from a particular place. So that's possible because IPFS uses content addressing, and so content is identified by what it is rather than where it is. And so each piece of content has a unique content ID. And when you look for that content ID, it ends up being retrieved from wherever's closest to you. So that means if someone else nearby on the moon, just in that example, already has retrieved that piece of content, then that data only has to travel a short distance and can get to you much more quickly instead of traveling back and forth from Earth with every click. So that means that this technology really makes sense as the basis for the communication systems that we're going to be seeing in space, you know, as the space economy grows. And that's why Lockheed Martin and Filecoin Foundation are working on having IPFS be the basis for those communications technologies in space in the future.
So, Marta, just to bring this conversation back to Earth for a second, you know, like theoretically, this is like very cool. I mean, this whole idea, I mean, we all know like the problems with Web 2, and we all know like the need for decentralized file storage totally makes sense. I guess the question is, can you give us some examples of where this is actually being used sort of in real life, like on Earth right now, you know, because my understanding of a lot of these sort of decentralized file storage, it's like it's still a little bit theoretical or a little bit niche, and you know, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but like who's using it and how and where and how, you know, large scale is this?
So actually, it's definitely not theoretical. So you know, so the Filecoin network is built on top of IPFS, and there's a ton of usage. So just one example of why this technology is so important is NFTs. So the vast majority of NFTs, when you look at where they're stored on IPFS. And the reason is, imagine that you're sort of someone has launched an NFT and they have a startup and they're paying their AWS bill and they're just storing this on AWS, right? Like the idea is you're going to have this content and its continued availability dependent on one server or one company. And so, you know, a lot of people on the internet and Twitter will say, you know, if it's not on IPFS, it's not really your NFT. So if you have it on IPFS, it's identified via a content ID rather than by a particular server, a location on a particular server in a particular place. So when you put in the content ID of that NFT, that's going to be retrieved from wherever's closest. If you have it on your computer, it's retrieved from there. wherever's closest it can be retrieved from, and there can be many copies of it across the network. Whereas if you have today's centralized internet model and you're looking for your NFT, you're going to be looking for it in a particular place and just hoping that it's not gone. And so that's just one example of why it's so important to have these decentralized file storage systems, and one example of how it's being used. Another example is when you want to make sure that data is persisting into the future, it's really important to use these technologies as a much more robust platform where you don't have single points of failure. And so another example is the Filecoin Foundation is working with the Starling Lab and the Shoah Foundation, which is a project of USC and Stanford, to store videos of war crimes, evidence of war crimes in Ukraine, and 50,000 videos of genocide survivors, so that evidence can persist into the future in a way that doesn't have single points of failure.
So that makes sense. And obviously anti-censorship is a great use case for this. And I guess the question is, the other side of it, though, is how do you deal with the sort of garbage in, garbage out problem? Like, how do you deal with, when this becomes more widely used and more widely adopted, how do you address the problem of having, quote unquote, fake news just like forever preserved, or incorrect information forever preserved? Because that seems like that's something that will happen as well. So what do you do with that?
Yeah, so I think a couple things. I mean, one thing is that on IPFS, there's this concept of pinning. And the other thing is not all content is preserved forever. You have to basically, have people storing it in, one or multiple places in order for it to be available on the network. So it's not like everything you put on the network remains there forever. And that was sort of actually the reason that Filecoin was built on top of IPFS. Was one of the issues with IPFS is, okay, great, if content is being made available, then it's available on the network, right? But you needed a way to incentivize people to make that data available, right? To actually pay people to store the data. And so that was why Filecoin was built, to actually provide the incentives to keep data on the network.
So you brought up a great point and a great use case, which is, of course, documenting and preserving the documentation of war crimes in Ukraine. And also there's the project you have in place now, or that you're starting with Muckrock, also to preserve and share files. But taking it back to the space project, I'm wondering, we currently have Congress members who want to defund NASA. In favor of funding, I don't know, like interpretive dance therapies for goat herders in cities. And at what point, we say, hey, you know what, this is kind of a far-flung thing to invest in trying to do all this stuff for space. We have pressing issues where this technology is needed on Earth. I'm trying to figure out how is the prioritization done there, or is it Lockheed Martin paying for everything in this situation?
Yeah, so I think the thing to think about there, so first of all, I don't think this is far-fetched at all. So just to be clear, what we're talking about is not actually blockchain in space. What we're talking about is decentralized storage in space and this decentralized networking protocol, IPFS, in space. And as I've described before, this isn't just sort of sending up, sort of a solution in search of a problem. This is actually solving an existing problem that comes from the existing sort of space infrastructure, right? And the fact that what we have right now with communications infrastructure, the centralized internet model, is just not going to work in space. So this solves that problem, and that's sort of why the interest in it. And I think the other thing I would say is it's not just about the government anymore. What we have is the space economy is rapidly emerging, right? You're having tons of things happening in space that are private, right? That are not based on the government. If you go back 10 years, it was just not even fathomable what SpaceX has done, for example, with rockets, right? And what was happening with rockets with SpaceX 10 years ago is sort of happening with other space technologies like satellites now, right? And so what you need, and one of the things that Lockheed has been talking about as we've been announcing this in Davos this week, is you need to have these communications infrastructure in space to make sure ensure that this space economy that's emerging can continue to thrive. And so we need to have some sort of way of doing this networking in space. And it turns out that IPFS was literally developed to solve the problem that you have with networking in space. And it's a much better model as the communications protocol for space technologies.
So it brings into mind, a question I have is, if it's making networking on Earth and in space more efficient, does it also remove barriers? Say, for instance, in Russia, folks who can't access certain things on the internet, will this make information more accessible to them, something that the government can't block?
So I think that's I think what we're talking about right now in our sort of early phase is, okay, we know that IPFS solves a lot of the problems that when you're looking to build communications infrastructure in space, as Lockheed is, these problems come up, and IPFS can really solve those problems. And so right now what we're looking at in this partnership with Lockheed is sort of what are the different ways that IPFS can be utilized in space. So whether that's literally networking on the moon, which is something that's a big part of the Artemis mission, or whether that's satellite to satellite communication, whether that's satellite to ground communication. And we're really in the sort of exploratory phase of, okay, what are the uses that make sense to start out with? And so in this exploratory phase, we're going to be looking at, what are the missions that we want to use as our sort of demonstration mission to show how this technology works in space. And so right now we're really in really what we're focusing on here is, how is this networking protocol, how do we actually deploy it in space? And, from there, what are the many different ways that it can be used, communicating, in an interplanetary way, a lunar way, satellite to satellite, Earth to ground, but lots of potential. And we're really just starting to explore that with Lockheed.